Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Book on Fire podcast. Today, we have a very, very special episode, and we have a couple of guests that we're excited to talk about the last chapter that we covered of the book, especially who have a special interest in it, but also just a contemporary experience that lines up with the book, which I'm excited to hear them talk about. I guess I'm just going to let you all introduce yourselves, if you don't mind.
Sure. Hey, Stone Go. My name is Jenna May. I am Deer Clan Muskogee and also of Cherokee and Eastern Siouan descent, living here in Bulbancha, currently known as New Orleans. I am a poet and an herbalist and a gardener and a parent and an ethnographer with a degree in anthropology. And I would say not, but nothing other than an anarchist. And I work in radio and communications and mutual aid organizing. And I have recently become a steward and builder of a contemporary monumental earthen architecture structure here in Bulbancha, known as Bulbancha.
Yeah.
Very cool. Welcome.
I am Ozone 504. At least that's the nom de guerre for today. I currently live in Bulbancha. My family is Monacan, Saponin, Lenape, Welsh, and Swedish descent. And I'm probably a bunch more too. And we're from the mountains of East Tennessee. But I've lived here in Bulbancha for, 22 years now.
Wow.
I am a radio engineer, chef, and a mound builder these days. I was the site lead for the building of Bulbancha and are part of the Intertribal Collective that brought it to life. And
yeah. All right. I'm so excited to hear from y'all today.
Yeah, that's great. And we're definitely going to take some time to talk about the Bulbancha project before we leave off from our conversation today, because that is very exciting.
I just wanted to say before we get to more of the topics at hand that also Ozone is an old friend of ours going back more than 20 years for sure. And now Jenna May for more than a decade. And we're friends and colleagues and co-conspirators in this world. And so I'm just really excited to give them, for all of you to get the chance to hear these folks talk.
Yeah, for sure. And having talked with them about The Dawn of Everything has shaped my reading of The Dawn of Everything for sure, from like a very early point in my engagement with this text. And so we've been looking forward to having them on to share thoughts about the book and related to the book for a couple of years or something.
Yeah. Because
maybe we've been talking about this.
Takes so long. Yeah. It's been a couple of years. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really exciting. I don't know. I guess I was wondering too, and maybe you already answered this question a little bit by giving us your introductions and your background, but just about when you read The Dawn of Everything, what are you bringing to your engagement with a book like that? Like what elements of your background or your interests or like your research interest, like I'm reading The Dawn of Everything as someone who's been an anarchist for like my whole adult life. And I also have interest in prehistory and anthropology, but I know that people are going to be reading The Dawn of Everything in different ways and from different perspectives, and curious if there's anything that you want to share about what you're bringing to engaging with these ideas.
I guess I could go first, about that. So I also have been active within the anarchist milieu since I was probably about 14 or 15 is when I originally got active in that milieu. But at the same time, I was also going to like the Intertribal Center in Atlanta and meeting folks from the intertribal community in Atlanta, and then later in Chattanooga, and then Asheville later and stuff too. So there was always like a connection with my ancestors in that regard, and attempting to connect with my ancestors in that regard and have community with other folks, native folks and native descent folks. And I'm also just a history buff and have grown up. And I grew up essentially in the Etowah River watershed, which Etowah is one of the major mound sites, and grew up visiting that site often. I enjoy history from all around the world, but particularly that there was a contemporary anarchist book that was referencing the history of North America. Like I was, was absolute must read, obviously. And I'm really glad that I dove deep into it. It's been a great ride, really, honestly.
Yeah, I think as a person of Native descent, and really specifically Southeastern Native descent, some of my life's work and my passion pursuits are pushing back against erasure in order to uncover, uplift, elucidate the many contributions of Indigenous peoples to our modern world, and uncover histories that have been suppressed or largely ignored, or really, I'd say, tarnished by historical and ongoing racism. Yeah. So that's some of what I'm bringing to the read of The Dawn of Everything.
Right.
Largely within, how do you say it? Like the text within what could be called anti-authoritarian writing. There's almost zero mention of Native North America. There is some, but there's very little when you compare it to when you especially think about how people were trying to struggle for some form of stateless society, and at the same time existing in some cases the same space as people who had a history of stateless society. So it's at times been like a glaring omission when there's starting to be. And they're starting to be out west, with Black Seed and work going on out west of developing an Indigenous anarchist perspective is being currently developed. It's probably not going to look very similar to a European-based anarchist perspective, but it is evolving. And there is going to, actually this year, there's going to be a gathering of Indigenous anarchists out west.
Oh, cool.
Excellent.
That's exciting. Well, you're leading actually to something that we were thinking about too, which is, I guess, to start to move towards the book more in general. The book is using their reading of the history of Indigenous folks from Turtle Island with what you're talking about in some ways, but trying to use it to counter preconceptions or the given narrative that we're given around how human society develops. And I guess we're wondering, what do you guys think about their project? And obviously there's a lot to be said around that, but the general sort of point of what they're doing, how do you feel about that point or their mission?
Before we get specific to chapter 11, I know that we're going to spend a lot of time on that specifically. Right. Yeah.
I, as someone that kind of participated in the rise of certain ideas within the green anarchist perspective in particular, but also being someone that's lived mostly urban my entire life, I've enjoyed their pushback against the kind of narrative that was developed within green anarchy. And especially part of what we've been up to, or what we like to bring out when talking about the mound cultures in the Southeast or across North America, is that because there's the colonization narrative that they were just hunter-gatherers living in the woods, right? Indigenous peoples. But there were actually cities and towns all across the Americas. And so that's kind of dovetails into this book, because they're saying it's not necessarily the city that's causing
right
the lean into authoritarianism.
Right.
So I definitely appreciate that being looked into and stuff.
Yeah, I think a point that I'm always trying to get across to people who are not familiar with the Indigenous Southeast is that, and especially in comparison to the urban and rural divides that define the American South now, I always try to get the point across that there were cities and an interconnected cosmopolitanism that is actually the ancient roots here. as just as a comparison to how the South is narrated now, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And also, I think when I first read The Dawn of Everything, I was also reading this work called The Indigenous Paleolithic by Paulette C. Steeves. And I remember telling y'all like, oh, these need to be read together. And I'm not entirely sure of that, like that it's an absolute necessity to read them together.
Yeah.
But one point that Paulette C. Steeves makes is this idea of pyroepistemology, that sometimes what is a part of the official canon is just so rotten but yet stubbornly enduring, that the best thing to do with it is to burn it to the ground so that new growth can flourish. And I feel like that idea of pyroepistemology is applicable to The Dawn of Everything, and maybe that's what the Davids are trying to do. And we can go into whether they're successful at that or not.
Right. And I think that when we first came in contact with both of those books, like part of it was also both of them were examining both new archaeology and new anthropology that had not really bubbled up to mainstream consciousness yet. And I think that was what was super exciting about having both of those books come out at a very similar time.
And the Indigenous Paleolithic is arguing thoroughly against the Bering Strait theory, and also arguing for the existence of indigenous peoples in the Americas for a lot longer time period, so then we can say that like indigenous peoples of the Americas had a lot longer to experiment with different forms of society and governance that is recognized by anthropologists and archaeologists, but hasn't made it into popular knowledge or even knowledge that gets disseminated in like school textbooks. And I feel like some of the stuff that the Davids are arguing, it's the same scenario where it's not contested among contemporary anthropologists or archaeologists anymore. And yet it's enduring stubbornly and probably intentionally so within popular culture.
Right. Yeah, that's true. There's a lot of that. And that's a really good point, for sure. I love that concept of pyroepistemology. It's a great word. And the analogy there, in case it's not totally clear, is to the indigenous fire management practices and how the land will be burned to allow for like lush new growth to form. And I think that's really insightful that maybe the Davids are trying to do a version of that too, by dismantling a lot of narratives to just open up the space. I think that is the biggest thing that the book is trying to do, is to open up the space for new stories to grow. And that maybe if the new stories can grow, then actually the new realities can grow too, or something like that.
No, I like that a lot. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. We would talk a lot earlier in the season about the sloppy demolition. And it's definitely a kinder framing to be like, actually, this could be a generative burn.
Yeah, a rejuvenating burn.
Yeah, which is a cool way to think about it. All right.
Yeah, that's great. Should we move on to the chapter under consideration, maybe?
Do you guys have anything else you want to add to the general overview before we start talking about the chapter?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks.
Awesome. With that as an introduction and some general thoughts about the book, maybe we can turn our attention, at least for the moment, to chapter 11, which was the full circle chapter, which was the last one that Janet and I read. And just to set the stage for what's going on in that chapter, in chapter 11, the Davids want to use the indigenous history of Turtle Island to prove that it's not necessary for human cultures to like always be moving towards greater concentration of power, towards the state, towards greater domination, because they're kind of saying, yeah, we see these trends in the Eurasian context, but is there someplace else that we can look for a counterexample? And they're using the indigenous history of Turtle Island as a counterexample. And they build the case that they're trying to make around the rise and fall of these like powerful, centralized Mississippian towns or chiefdoms or whatever you want to call them. They go by different names depending on who's talking, that were led by a hereditary elite and all of this type of thing, that they detail in the chapter. And that over the course of a few hundred years, you see like the rise and fall of this form of power in Turtle Island, especially in the eastern part. And they talk about Cahokia in that context and about Coosa. And their assumption is that that phase of history was not a happy one for most of the people who lived in the sphere of influence of these powerful chiefdoms, to use the anthropological term. And they want to see the later dominance of more democratic, kind of like council-based, less urbanized indigenous cultures as embodying a reaction to that phase of the Mississippian culture. And to them, that's an example that shows that even though like hierarchical excesses of power can rise and oppress people, that it's also within people's power to push back against that and to steer the course of history in a different direction. But so that's like the main idea. And they have all this evidence that we can talk about that they marshal to kind of make their case. And they end up talking about the southeastern indigenous tribes, but also the Osage and eventually the Haudenosaunee. But I think the one thing that we've all noticed is that like the story that they're telling, they overlook a lot in their need to very much streamline and simplify indigenous history so that it fits the argument that they're trying to make. And like part of what we want to talk about here is to tell a fuller story.
Yeah, I mean, I think, where do I want to start? I have 5 thoughts at once. Okay, well, we can start with Cahokia.
Yeah.
So I want to bring in Timothy Pocketat, the scholar Timothy Pocketat, who is considered like to be like a renowned scholar of Cahokia.
Yeah, the Davids definitely referenced Pocketat for a lot of their history of Cahokia, I believe. I remember his name from the bibliography.
Yeah, Timothy R. Pocketat, his newest book is Gods of Thunder, How Climate Change, Travel, and Spirituality Reshaped Pre-Colonial America. And yeah, the first glaring omission from the Davids is the impact of climate on the rise and fall of Cahokia. And so Pocketat talks about the medieval warming period and how that pretty much lines up pretty succinctly with the rise and the fall of Cahokia. And so the medieval warming period would have affected different areas differently. There could, like in the American bottom that they're talking about, temperatures got a little warmer and a little wetter, which was fertile for the development of Cahokia. And then when that medieval warming period ends, that same area would have gotten drier and colder. And that's missing from the Davids' analysis of especially the fall of Cahokia, the collapse or the abandonment of Cahokia. And yeah, just the environmental factors are left out for this, for the shaping of this idea of a rebellion against hierarchy, which could have been happening, but the environmental limits of that time period were also very much at play. And Pocketat also argues that in the same time period, travel is huge, and there is a lot of influence coming from Mesoamerica and traveling up north. And he argues that it is a whole like package or a suite of different things that travel, which include architectural forms, but also include some iconography and symbology and ritual practices. And they have a really massive spread, especially in the north of Turtle Island. And things that I find interesting about Cahokia are like how Cahokia influenced spirituality in the Great Plains region. And because that's not really talked about, right? And also, I want to say that Pocketat contends that there's a few different things that he's talking about Cahokia. One, he mentions in a podcast that Cahokia at first was like largely a cooperative experiment, and then later gets more hierarchical. And then we see like the building of the Palisades. Another interesting point he makes is that Cahokia at its height, which is closer to its beginning, was 30% migrants. And I know that the Davids frame that as like some sort of coercive move. But I like my thinking, I want to challenge that a little bit, especially considering this extensive history of trade and travel and how there might be other beneficial reasons for people from a lot of different nations or backgrounds gathering together and living together. Yeah. So I think those are where I want to start with the discussion of Cahokia. Oh, and then also Paquette argues that contrary to what the Davids are saying, like after the collapse or abandonment of Cahokia, these Mississippian worldviews spread and actually become more hierarchical, which seems to be in direct conflict with what the Davids are trying to argue. Yeah.
And so I guess, I'm curious about that because you said that something like that the other day. And I guess I was curious. They seem to be judging basically more on, is there evidence of hierarchy in the archaeological record, maybe? When they don't see the same kinds of structures or grave sites, they think there's less hierarchy. And not that they think that's the only way to look at things, but I'm curious. I was curious about when it became more hierarchical during the diasporic time when people were spreading out.
Or at least the influence was spreading, but probably the people too.
Does it mean that even smaller groups, there was more hierarchical structure? I'm just curious about what it looked like, if it's known.
The Davids seem to square this by making the argument that there's the argument that there's no progression from fiefdoms to states, and actually it goes the opposite way, where maybe Cahokia is the first state. And then we move into chiefdoms. And there's one particularly, it's like offensive line that the Davids use. They're beginning to talk about the Osages and the fall of Cahokia. And they say, insofar as we can speak of states and chiefdoms at all, in the case of Native North America, the state-making project seems to come first, virtually out of nowhere, which I would argue against because they talk about Hopewell, and before Hopewell, there's the Adena culture. And the chiefdoms observed by De Soto and his successors appear to be little more than the rubble left behind by its downfall. And I want to pick a big fight with that sentence.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, that doesn't even seem to square with the evidence that they're drawing from themselves, or even what they okay, to back up a little bit with this, everything that you've been bringing in. I mean, one thing, when I was revisiting this material, just even for this conversation today, one thing that I had to be reminded of is that Cahokia's dates are, I'm not going to get it exactly, but it's somewhere around maybe 1000 AD at the earliest to 1300 or something, right? But then when De Soto was rampaging around, he was encountering Mississippian polities in this style in the mid 1500s.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's like a 200 and something year spread. Cahokia had come and gone, and then the Mississippian, this style was still going on for a long time. And it's hard to really argue that there was a lot of dependency on Cahokia itself in order to keep this thing going. Obviously, it had a life of its own. And what De Soto encountered was not like a, whatever they said, a rubble.
Right.
Yeah.
Whatever. That doesn't even, yeah. I don't know where that statement comes from or why they're even choosing to put it that way. But I noticed that too. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, it sucks to have to depend on De Soto's account of it for this, because that was the beginning of the end of the Mississippians, in my point of view. Right. But it definitely, if you read the descriptions of the societies he's traveling through, they don't seem to be, they're not small to begin with. And he'll get to the end of one territory and then hit another people's territory with hundreds of thousands of people in it again.
Right.
There was just that one place between Georgia and South Carolina that they found that nobody really lived in on their whole tour through the Southeast. Yeah, it baffles me their choice of language in this book about that. Yeah. I was, this is kind of a side note of like, how is it that they know that the hierarchies were hereditary?
Mm.
Oh, that's a good question. And I
Because
don't,
like particularly say the Haudenosaunee, and even say within like contemporary ceremonial grounds, like with the Haudenosaunee, the chiefs, like it's the same name for them, but it's
Mhm.
occupied by different people. It doesn't pass down
Through blood.
right.
Right.
blood. And
Yeah.
Mm.
the leadership of ceremonial grounds is voted on.
Mm.
It's also not passed down through blood. It might
Mhm.
happen, that happens sometimes, but it is a decision that's made by people, like to, and so it's not a guarantee that the child of someone would necessarily inherit the same role as their
Right.
elder.
Mhm.
Yeah. When I have repeated that, it's just from repeating what's in the anthropological literature. And I don't know where scholars are getting that conclusion.
No, I know that that's important in other indigenous cultures. Also, like the one thing is that there can be no blanket statements made about indigenous cultures in the Americas at all. They're a
Mhm.
vast array, and probably some of them that are the most similar are the southeastern cultures because of this once semi or
Hmm.
interlocked society. But other cultures definitely have hereditary chiefdoms as an important part, and it's part of what they're trained as like a family to do is help people reach consensus. They're like the mediators of everybody.
Mm.
Like some families are hunters and some families are the professional mediators.
Right.
And we can't forget about the clan system here as
Right.
well, which the Davids argue during this period of Mississippian culture that is extremely hierarchical, the importance of the clan system gets subsumed by like a priest class or
Mhm.
like,
Right.
these petty big man rulers.
Mhm.
And I would doubt that as well. Oh, and this is because of the importance in the Americas on travel and trade, and not just trade in goods, but trade in ideas.
Mm.
And a lot of that takes place through the clan system.
Mhm.
Like you travel and you have relatives everywhere because they're a part of your same clan. And so there is diplomacy and kinship networks that make this extensive travel possible. And I wonder first if those mark their own sort of power that then gives a check and balance to the power of the centralized chiefdom at any
Right.
given point.
Yeah, now that you mention it, I'm realizing that the Davids, they seem to enjoy talking about the clan system,
Right.
and it's a big idea for them. But in this narrative, once they get past, Hopewell, it disappears from the story
Right.
that they're telling.
Right.
And why is that?
And then suddenly reemerges in this more egalitarian time that kind
Right.
of corresponds with the historic period of Southeastern Indigenous peoples. And I would argue that the clan system never disappeared and
Sure.
was probably really important to travel and trade, both in ideas and in goods. It's still an extremely important part of, it has been impacted by ongoing colonialism for sure. But
Right. Right. Yeah, and I would be surprised if the Davids thought that the clan system disappeared during the Mississippian phase, but they definitely don't account for what the clan system is contributing during that time period. And yeah, that does feel like a glaring omission because there are different locations of power and influence, right? It's not just they want to shine the light at the top of the mound in their imagination because that's the story that they're trying to tell, but it's more complicated than that, right?
Yeah, for sure.
I think also that it's especially, I think people can see the clan system as being like almost like the hokey new age spirit animal thing without seeing that the clan system actually was like an aspect of a form of governance, and that each clan has a specific role that they're supposed to play in the functioning of the nations. Like they have an assigned responsibilities. And it's not just, there is some part of it that's like a little on the spiritual side, but it's not like, there is also more concrete things that each clan has a role in doing within the
Society. Yeah.
Yeah. And that reminds me of something that I think you were saying, Ozone, in our last conversation about how like one thing that the Davids are bringing to a lot of these conversations is, I don't know, a sort of, maybe I would call it, I mean, this is me interpreting what you were saying, but a kind of like enlightenment type of worldview where you can consider the political reality of people as a separate sphere from the other aspects of life, including the spiritual. But that's a very like European thing and kind of like enlightenment way of looking at it. But the Davids always just want to consider the political as its own thing.
Yeah, like how the maintenance of the consensus and that everyone gets their say is part of the spirituality of it. Like it's what makes the people's who they are. It's like part of what, it's like an intricate part of the fabric of who they are. How the decisions are made. You know?
And likely has specific ceremonies attached to that process as well, which is not necessarily a part of the Enlightenment era separation of the political from
the rest of life.
From the rest of life. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, I hadn't put this together until now, actually, but it's interesting because there's a couple things that they consistently do. That is one, the political separate from life, but also the consistent, not exactly denial, but failure to consider ecology or even climate in the situation you're talking about with Cahokia, Jenna May earlier. But the fact that they don't want to reduce things to material conditions, so they don't talk too much about the ecology around people and how it makes them, and that they're part of it. The people and the society are not separate from their surroundings, and that also the political is separate from the rest of life. So there's these two forms of separation that I think of both of as being like Enlightenment, rationalist reductionism, where we disconnect the individual, we disconnect the society in that tradition. And it does seem like both of those are happening in this history.
Yeah, I think going back to this idea of there being power in trade and travel and who's doing the trade and traveling, I also think about the river system and how the rivers and those who travel the rivers are carrying goods and ideas in the river systems and how that is its own form of power.
And how the rivers are shaping all of that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's what's more interesting to me than this kind of narrative that the Davids are trying to set up is that in the Mississippian period, there are people who are intentionally choosing to be autonomous from the big chiefdom centers.
Yeah.
And there are other people who are interacting with the big chiefdom centers in really important roles, but still on the outskirts of it. And that, like, looking at those people and what they're doing is just far more interesting to me than this narratives that the Davids are trying to build. Because I think Ozone said something in our call last week about, like, as an anarchist, I want to believe their narrative.
Right.
But it's just like the evidence doesn't bear that out. But what I can say is that maybe there were more egalitarian forms of existence happening at the same time as these like centralized hierarchical, and then they were informing each other. I'm specifically thinking about Eastern Siouans. And there seems to be some arguments about a dichotomy between Eastern Siouans that participated and were at the center of the Mississippian world to the south in like South Carolina versus like these Siouan Hill people further to the north that kind of existed outside of that. And newer archaeology seems to be telling a different story, that there was a lot more fluidity between those who kind of the hill people that lived more autonomously from bigger city centers. And when I'm talking about trade and travel, I'm specifically thinking about Eastern Siouans. But then if you think about like where we're at here and the Mississippi River as being one of these ecological features that help the trade and travel and spread of ideas. And yeah, who are those people? Like, because also there's this idea that people are being coerced into these arrangements around these Mississippi chiefdoms. But then you have these examples of people like Eastern Siouans being one example, but then also Elizabeth Ellis talks about in this book, The Great Power of Small Nations, the Plaquemine culture, which is a subset of Mississippian culture in the lower Mississippi Valley,
right.
who are building these giant mounds, but are not participating in these large city centers. Throughout the Mississippian period, they are coming together to build these monumental earthen structures, but then they're living in smaller settlements, right?
Yeah.
But absolutely participating in Mississippian culture. And I am more interested in first how they informed each other, and next, how these already kind of autonomous settlements informed later organizations of people in this Mississippi Shatter Zone time period and in the early colonial period.
Yeah, like the implication maybe being is what you're suggesting, that maybe the influence of these more autonomous folks could just as easily account for the quote unquote like democratic nature of the historical tribes that the Davids are concerned with as a reaction against like Mississippian excesses of power or something like that.
Yeah, that's one question I have. Another one that I think the Davids are seeing is, and this is like within the Mississippi Shatter Zone timeframe and like the beginning of the colonial era, the Davids are seeing this move to smaller settlements that are more dispersed and less centralized, but they're also not accounting for European diseases that may have impacted those choices as well. Yeah. And that there already may have been maps for that particular type of settlement. And I'm also not trying to like dispose of Indigenous political agency in this moment. But I do think it's way more, I think it's more complex. There are environmental factors. There are people who have always lived outside of it informing what these city centers were doing. And that's a fuller picture to me.
Yeah, maybe to summarize some of this stuff, when we might say, you know, like Ozone said, as an anarchist, I want to believe their narrative, but maybe the evidence doesn't bear it out. Part of what we're talking about here is that the Davids are potentially overestimating the dominance and the oppressiveness of these Mississippian polities that they're examining. They're not accounting for nuances of power that might have been existing within them. And they're also not accounting for the people who lived outside of these towns, but were like a meaningful part of the culture, interacting with them in different ways. What more do we want to say?
I wanted to actually pick up on something Jenna was saying this time and the last time we talked, which I hadn't really thought about. They acknowledge in the book that they are giving less emphasis on the colonial context than most historians would. But it's so true and makes so much sense that people would choose to gather in smaller groups and settle in smaller groups in times of mass contagion. And until Jenna May said that last week, I was like, I just hadn't thought about that as a strategy, that people generally, despite whatever all amount of bullshit that we've heard from people in the past few years about how disease works and stuff, people have known for a very long time that to avoid contagion, there are certain practices that help, including reducing the number of people you're around.
Yeah.
And so that absolutely makes sense as a strategy. And so when you're just emphasizing it as a political choice devoid of context, then you're going to ignore that kind of reality. So I think that was a really helpful framing for me to be reminded of.
Yeah, definitely.
So I thought experiment I got off on in the last couple of days is trying to think of what cities in the last couple of 100 years have become abandoned. And I don't know if Jenna mentioned Detroit is a certain point. It seemed like it was going that way. And then definitely New Orleans is in what you call starting to enter a descent in a certain sense from a lot of factors. It's like environmental, cultural. And I try to see like, well, what could that have been like in Cahokia? Because you can argue that New Orleans is an authoritarian chiefdom.
Right.
But does that really reflect the life that most New Orleanians live in, that they feel like they're under the thumb of the mayor of New Orleans? I know. Do you feel like you're under the thumb of the mayor of New Orleans? I feel like I suffer from their bad decisions. I consider no longer living here.
Right.
I feel like, yeah, we all respond to these various pressures living in this space, right? Yeah.
That actually sounds like a very dawn of everything type of thought, where the Davids are always like, yeah, I mean, technically there was like this hierarchy or there was this leader, but really people mostly did what they wanted to a lot of the time.
And then that's something that we're doing as a project, as a community, is just making sure that we look after each other, and because we're not going to get looked after by a city hall or whatever. So we have to be dependent on each other. And that's part of a larger project that we're up to. I like y'all too, like all of us basically. But
Yeah.
We're starting to get ready for hurricane season again.
Sure.
Starting back on the front part of the mind again.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a book called A Sacred Path, The Way of the Muskogee Creeks by Jean Hill Chowdhury and Joyet Paul Chowdhury, which kind of traces Muskogean beliefs and practices since time immemorial. And she really argues that like mound building culture and the Mississippian period, to think of it more as like a cultural continuity rather than a break from that. And then she argues that we have to look even before Mississippian culture, right? And Elizabeth Ellis talks about this too, that especially in the lower Mississippi Valley, people had been building mounds for thousands of years, right? And Jean Hill Chowdhury is arguing the same thing for Muskogee Creek peoples. There is a cultural continuity. And so like the Davids try to make these big divides between, say, Hopewell and Cahokia. And I just don't think that existed. And contemporary Indigenous scholars are making that argument as well. Yeah. And then there's also discussion of people not building mounds anymore. And we've definitely heard from elders that like our mound building practices diminishing were a direct result of the colonial incursions and violence, and less so that people like didn't want to build these elevated structures so that they could surveil others or something, You
think about it, like in order to take on a monumental architecture project like this, you need control of some territory, because you got to choose a spot to do it that's going to have a large source of clay and the other materials. You need to have a stable food supply for the people that are going to be working on it. You probably need a period of peace.
Relative peace,
most people aren't actually engaged in warfare or having to move around because of warfare. You probably need people to be pretty damn healthy, because you can't be sick and doing something like that. And so none of those factors existed in the colonial era. Like, people were losing control of their land bases. They were in a state of constant warfare, and also being ravaged by diseases. So of course that practice was going to not be possible any longer because of those factors. Now, if those things reverse, like people start having control of like large amounts of territory again, would people start building mounds again? I bet you they would.
Right.
Like, and just straight up.
Yeah. And Elizabeth Ellis talks about well into the 17th century in the lower Mississippi Valley. Even if people aren't building mounds anymore, they're still using the mounds that already exist for ceremony, and even building structures like these like temple structures on top of them. And Jean Hill Chowdhury, this is such an interesting little tidbit that she mentions in talking about the continuance, the cultural continuance of the importance of mounds, is that they find in Muskogee cemeteries in Oklahoma, people building mini platform mounds for their burials. And so what she says is like the mounds themselves may have started shrinking, but their importance never did.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for noting that for sure and bringing all of that in. It's definitely true that like if the Davids was your only source, then you could think that, I don't know, that like before Cahokia, mounds could have these like cool functions in Hopewell and Poverty Point and whatever, but then the Mississippian culture just appropriated the mound form and turned it into a tool of oppression or something. And then they just leave it off there and say with the fall of that was the end of the story of the mounds. And I think that is the way that the book presents it. And I'm glad that you are correcting that for sure.
And then one of the things that made me sad about the book and their referencing of Cahokia is that for a large part, by and large, this is going to be a lot of people's first ever hearing about Cahokia. And probably about that, like monumental architecture, culture in the Americas period. It's probably their first point of contact. And I've already experienced this being the case with some folks that have visited to the Nani Bulbancha, and to like have their first contact with the history of Cahokia and the importance of Cahokia just be as this framed in kind of a negative way.
For sure.
It makes me sad, It's like, what if the first thing you ever heard about Paris was just about some terrible act by one of the rulers of Paris? Does that discount all of the rest of the history of Paris? Like what Paris symbolizes? I don't think. And I just wish that people could, because like this, we've been talking about these sites. And one thing that if you visit a bunch of them, one thing you're going to notice is that there's almost always a railroad track close. And say at Moundville, the railroad runs right through the middle of the site. Right. And the next thing I'm going to say is no diss to anybody that does sex work, but like you used to stand on top of Monk's Mound at Cahokia, and you could see a strip club, you could see a dump, you could see a highway, you could see a railroad line running right through what would have been part of that site. These areas aren't treated as the kind of cultural patrimony that they deserve to be treated at. They're seen as like, just something interesting kind of in the corner, and it's like land that we feel like is maybe important enough not to completely turn up, although that has happened too, where mounds have just been plowed down and used for road fill and all that. So to have it surfacing in the popular mind as a negative kind of just adds a little bit more of that hurt to how these sites have all been mismanaged since the beginning of the colonial period.
Right, because we're pushing, like most people don't know that there are, even here in Louisiana, hundreds upon hundreds of mound sites. People don't know that they're not just piles of dirt, but they required science and engineering and astronomy and all of this different stuff. Right. They are still actively being damaged or disrespected, and not in like scholarly spheres, but in other popular spheres, we're still contending with narratives that ancient aliens or like some group of proto-Europeans or lost tribes of Israel built these monumental earthwork art structures and not indigenous people, right? And so, it feels sad when a fuller picture of the Americas has never been part of popular culture, but these things are,
Right. Well, it's fascinating that it goes down like that because so much of the book is about rescuing cities from being derided as inevitably hierarchical places. And also they want to talk a lot about how even places that have periods of hierarchy can go in and out of it. They have a lot of goals of impermanence with hierarchy and goals of disrupting the history, but for whatever reason, they don't do that with Cahokia. And I'm not sure, I guess it's because they want to say that this point that everyone chose otherwise afterwards because of how bad it was or something. And it's built into it. But it is interesting that you would think they would get behind a lot of what you guys are saying, which Cahokia was beautiful and complicated and had a lot of different things going on.
Well, I mean, I feel like they do that, but not with Cahokia, right? Because and then this is a point that Ozone brought up, is that like Rousseau romanticizing Indigenous.
Because that's what in the first part of their book, they're really kind of bagging on Rousseau.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for the romanticizing of the noble savage or whatever. And then in a certain sense, they do the same thing towards the end of the book. And I just think it's interesting, like, how come the editor didn't guess?
Yeah.
Like maybe y'all shouldn't do the same thing that y'all did where it kind of dissing in the first part of the book, all of this, like all of the history of the Americas, North, South, and Central, are incredibly fascinating and deserve the respect and the time and the study in their own rights without having to be included in some narrative that makes it legitimate to a political ideology of any assortment. And that all those societies get to be like as complex, and some of them were super authoritarian, some of them were stateless, and that's beautiful. That's a beautiful thing, but it doesn't have to. People should love that just for the love of learning and the love of knowledge, and just not just to use as a foil in an argument, that they're trying to win.
Which is exactly what they're doing. They're instrumentalizing history in order to give like a lesson about something.
To pan out, part of what I've been thinking about, because I think that all of that criticism is so valid, I think that they're like, we want to blow up all these big theories. We want to destabilize the territory on which all this shit is built upon. And so to do that, we're going to write the big book. We're going to talk about the big ideas. This isn't in fashion anymore, but we're going to do that. And then I'm like, is it not actually possible to do the thing that they're trying to do without instrumentalizing history? I don't know if this is true or not, and this might just be a rhetorical question, but I've thought about it because some of the choices they make, I'm super confused by. But I'm like, is it necessary for the project or something? I don't think it has to be, but it feels almost like they think it is or something.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I feel like it's maybe like the limits of this idea of pyroepistemology applied to this book.
Yeah.
Because at moments they are creating that new ground, new space.
Right.
But then at other moments they're reinforcing Western ideals or Western narratives.
And I guess another point I would like to make that's not necessarily about their writing, but just in general, is that the reclaiming of traditional governance within indigenous societies, even if it doesn't fit into the left-right spectrum that kind of comes from Europe, like is an extremely important part of the process of decolonization. And it is extremely radical in countering colonization. And I think that it's something, even if it's not something that is like, say, anarchist in particular, like, I think it's important for anti-authoritarians to sometimes support, you don't have to be uncritically supportive of traditional indigenous leadership, but to be supportive and understand that's an important thing for those communities to be engaging in. And by this, I don't mean tribal councils. Those are that's a colonial entity.
Right.
But like when people are actually engaged in their traditional governance structures, like that is something I feel like anti-authoritarians should be supportive of, even if it is a little more authoritarian than they would feel comfortable with.
Yeah, I hear that.
Yeah, I also wanted to note that there's this interesting point that the Davids are making in chapter 11 around arguing against that. I think, what are the words they use? Making a point that you don't need writing to develop political theories.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Am I getting that right?
Yeah, and to have an intellectual tradition.
Oh, yeah, an intellectual tradition. And then I think that's a really important point to make. And also, just in terms of this larger discussion of what's been erased and what's been suppressed, is evidence of writing all over the Americas. There's like, unfortunately, only tantalizing little morsels here and there. I mean, not in like, Mesoamerica, obviously. There's only tantalizing little morsels that haven't been thoroughly studied, but there is. So we even need to step back from that, right? I think that the Davids are making good arguments and in that regard. And what if people of the Americas had a rich intellectual tradition in addition to writing? Because and some of the work that I've read on this that we don't have to talk about for very long. First, it comes from for listeners, there's this YouTube content creator named Twin Rabbit that I think people should check out. And there's 2 different episodes. One is called Stolen Anarchy, Playing Indian and the Roots of Collectivism, that I think tie really nicely with the dawn of everything. And then the other one that specifically talks about the evidence of different writing systems in the Caribbean and North America is called Plain Sign and the Myth of Indigenous Illiteracy. And I think that both of those episodes really inform this discussion and the whole book. And that content creator points to the work of Jan Simic in talking about symbols uncovered in like Tennessee and Alabama cave systems, and how those symbols may have influenced the development of the Cherokee syllabary, which is, for folks who don't know, was developed by a man named Sequoyah. And just how maybe these older forms of possible writing informed the development of the syllabary.
And one important part, I think, of that is that the original drawings of the syllabary that Sequoyah had made, none of the characters looked like Roman characters. When they went to make the typeface for it, they didn't have enough money at the time to actually have all of the characters that he had made into the letters that he had designed or recorded or whatever. So they had to make a compromise on some of them, and that's how the Roman style characters got into this.
Oh, wow.
So his original drawings of it looks nothing like the Roman alphabet at all.
But does look a lot like some of the symbols found in these cave systems.
And then others, I don't have the quote, or I would have to look it up, but some people have proposed that there was some form of the syllabary before Sequoyah developed it, and that was why the Cherokee Nation was able to reach 80% literacy as quickly as they did, is because they already had some form of it that was active before it was codified by Sequoyah.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
It's exciting. It's super exciting.
No, it's super exciting. And then Twin Rabbit points to the work of Puerto Rican archaeologist Rene Rodriguez Ramos, who has been deciphering the symbols found in stone tablets made by Taino and Kalinago people that originally were found by Catholic priests in the 1880s who were convinced that this was evidence of the tribes of Israel being in the Caribbean. And as soon as they found out that wasn't the case, they declared them forgeries, and then they ended up in the Smithsonian, sometimes used as door stoppers for 120 years before this Puerto Rican archaeologist started this. And he's been able to decipher 20 repetitive symbols in these stone tablets. Wow. And yeah, so that's just some like really fun wormholes to go down. Mm-hmm. If we want to talk about like the full brilliance of indigenous cultures prior to colonization, but we can easily talk about the full brilliance of indigenous peoples post-colonization as well.
Yeah, the tribes of Israel really got around
really did.
to hear it told by the colonizers. They were seeing their traces everywhere. Keep hearing about that. Well, on the subject of all of these indigenous earthworks across Turtle Island, do y'all want to talk about the project that y'all are engaged with right now?
Sure. Ozone, you take the lead.
Okay, so what was it? It's been about 2 years now that we've been working on Nani Bulbancha. So there's an arts group here, or I guess they're outside of here too, but they're called Prospect. And after the George Floyd rebellion and the removal of various Confederate monuments across the South, they conceived of a project it's called the Project of Public Memory.
Artists of Public
Memory. And they were like, asked themselves the question, what would monuments by communities who have been like Black and Indigenous communities, essentially. What kind of monuments would those artists in those communities like to see? And we were approached about what kind of monument we would like to see. And it was kind of unanimous that we were like, we want to build a mound. And Dr. Tammy Greer, who's part of the project, has a history and wanting to try to do this. And then I think for me and Jenna May in particular, there was when Dr. Jeffrey Darensbourg and us were working on Bulbancha Still a Place, he had uncovered an article about a mound being used as road fill in the 1930s. Like it was an article from the 1930s, and it was talking about how an alligator effigy mound had been dug up to be used as road fill, and that this mound had human bones in it too that were making up the road bed. And I think at that point, I personally had decided that I want to build a mound as an act of, I don't know, almost want to say revenge or a little bit of get back, because that was such a painful story.
And I also want to just note in this story that Dr. Jeffrey Darensbourg is of the Atakapa Ishak Nation, and this article that he uncovered was about Ishak mounds. So This is his ancestors being dug up in order to make road fill.
Yeah. And it was just, it was pain. Of course, it was painful for him to be reading that. Anybody with a heart, that should have some effect on them. So I guess we began talking it into existence in some way, and then Dr. Greer in her own way. So Prospect was like, they had onboarded Shayna Griffin and Monique Verdun as like the curators of this particular project. And Monique, who's also part of the Nani Bulbancha build team, asked us, a few of us, what kind of monument we would like to see, and that's what we did. And so that's what we've been working. It took us a very long time to get the actual legal document signed. So we're like a year, easily a year behind schedule. And so, we received the permission from the city to build this monumental earthwork on what's known as the Lafitte Greenway, which was an area that's had multiple uses over the history of New Orleans, and that was a canal at one point, and then kind of a train line with an industrial corridor kind of between the French Quarter and
the Bayou. Yeah.
And
now it has been developed into a green space and public park.
Yeah. So we're on what's known as the main lawn of that, because there were some offers of different spots and that were maybe like a little less visible. And I think the visibility of it for us was important, because we wanted to be a place, not only just a spot for Indigenous people to gather in the city, because there aren't any, despite there being a documented Indigenous presence in New Orleans since before it was New Orleans. There's not a single, this is the only monument in New Orleans for Indigenous people, and definitely the only one by Indigenous people, Indigenous descent people. And like, Yeah, so we've been
Is there anything you
we
want to say
built
about the design and the
well,
build process?
the build process has been intense and hectic and beautiful. And unfortunately, because we didn't have control of our territories, we couldn't pick the best site that had the most accessible clay present for it. So we imported some clay from Morgan City. It's actually surprisingly hard to find clay. I didn't know this before we started the project. So we also consulted with some archaeologists that are doing work, and particularly in Louisiana, about how the mounds were constructed here and the intentionality of the different layers. And so some of the materials we used, we worked with was CRCL. What's that stand for? They collect oyster shells from all of the restaurants around the all the restaurants around the New Orleans area. But they got a big old oyster shell lot down in Violet, Louisiana.
Amazing.
So they gave us access to their oysters.
Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana.
Right.
I think that's important. Yeah.
Because particularly with the monumental earthworks down here, the oyster shells were an important part of creating like the lime that kind of leaches out of the oyster shells over time. Or not just oyster shells, but shells in general. It helps create more stability in the structure,
Sure.
What creates a limestone or a pack. You know? And then the other thing that they had found is that because they used baskets to carry the soil from one place to another, that when the baskets would break, they would just put the basket down into the mound. And that structure of the baskets is another thing that helps maintain the structure of the mound. And so we had community work days where we went and harvested a bunch of palm leaves, like palmetto leaves, a giant truck of palmetto leaves. And we had community work days where people sat there and weaved like little baskets together and mats together. And we incorporated that into the layers of the mound. And we also, a more contemporary material we used is what's known as bagasse, which is a byproduct of sugar production. It's what's over after they squeeze all the sugar juice out of it. And so that was a material, because in the old days, it would have been Spanish moss that would have been incorporated.
Right.
Which there's some of that in there also, but we had a ready supply of bagasse, which is a trip to go to the mountains of bagasse that exist.
And it was important to acknowledge some of the colonial and extractive history here, because this is a contemporary mound. And not only was it like a free source of something that's like a byproduct of an extractive industry, but it's also, we have called Bulbancha the neutral ground mound, where it is Indigenous led and Indigenous centered, but we welcome everybody to create a neutral ground and a space for coming together and gathering and learning and sharing of ideas. And we really wanted to acknowledge the many histories and many peoples in this place called Bulbancha, which is the place of many languages, right? And so the materials we used also, we really tried to make reflect that as well.
I'm so glad that you brought up what Bulbancha means, because I was realizing we didn't do that at the beginning, and it's so beautiful and speaks to the history of the place that you are.
And that is
the neutral ground mound too. That's so, and just the layers of meaning there. I just love that so much.
And then we also asked people to contribute a little bit of soil from their place where they lived. And I have to say, when I put out the soil from y'all's house,
oh, sweet.
Sweet.
Yeah, we sent a little bit from the mountains up here.
Yeah.
So we wanted to first acknowledge the Mississippi River, and that the land we live on here would not be possible without all of the sediments from all these other lands moving with the river to form this land. And so that was one part of asking people to send in soil. And then there's also another part of we are losing land here in South Louisiana.
Right.
And I think it's really good to frame that around, we are the nation's wetlands and we all have a responsibility in protecting those wetlands. And so asking people to send soil from their homelands or a special place to them is a way to ask people to make a commitment to South Louisiana.
Yeah.
Right.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful project. I'm really excited to share pictures and stuff too once this episode comes out so people can check it out. Yeah, I know we all probably need to go, but I was wondering if just briefly the name Bulbancha does speak to the history of that place a little bit. And if you just want to say a couple sentences or something about that name.
I also just want to talk about why we named it Nani Bulbancha.
Yeah, Nane.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
do that.
All
Nane.
that. Great.
Because, okay, so when we began this project, we were, because there, at least in English, a mound, it's just like, a mound of dirt, a mound. And
Great.
well, and there is a move amongst certain archaeologists to start calling them pyramids, right?
Mm.
They don't look like the Egyptian pyramids, but that's essentially what they are, is the same thing. They call the ones in Mayan pyramids, but they're flat-topped pyramids as well, right? But Dr. Greer in particular pointed out that the word pyramid itself was a Greek word that was making fun of the Egyptians, and they had a type of pastry that was called a pyramid, and that was them like poking fun at the Egyptians by calling them pyramids. And so then we were like, to heck with using a non-Indigenous word for it, period. And so we both before the colonial era and during the colonial era, there was a trade language in the South, this part of the Southeast and a little further out, that it was called Mobilian. And it allowed the different tribes to talk with each other and have trade. But a large part of its vocabulary is based in Muskogee or Choctaw also. And so while the word for mound in Mobilian didn't actually survive down to our contemporary times, we decided to source that word from Choctaw like they probably would have during the formation of Mobilian at some point too. And
But yeah, Nane means hill or mountain in Chata. And the name Bulbancha actually comes from Chata as well. And it's kind of what's the word? Like in English, when you say like can't instead of cannot, Bulbancha, it's
Contraction.
a contraction of a few different words, but put together means place of many languages, or one translation from a Chata elder was place of babbling tongues, which I love, because I think about what I think about when I hear place of babbling tongues is like the chatter of river water, right?
Yeah.
I just imagine like peoples and sediments chattering and swirling together and making their way down here, right?
Right.
And Bulbancha is the only recorded pre-colonial name of this land.
Oh, okay.
Almost all of the other indigenous names are in reference to this being a colonial space. And so Bulbancha is the only pre-colonial one that has been recorded. Of course, there were up to 40 different tribal nations that seasonally gathered and utilized this land as a port and as a hub. And those names have been lost to history. But the Chata one has not. And so that is why we call it Nane Bulbancha.
Yeah. It's really beautiful.
Yeah. And y'all had your grand opening, right?
we did.
Yeah.
Although work continues on it.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
And we do plan to seed some native plant gardens around the Nane in the months to come. That's a really important piece for many of us working on this project, and especially Dr. Tammy Greer, who is the head of the Center for American Indian Research and Studies at the University of Mississippi in Hattiesburg. And she also stewards the medicine wheel garden there on campus with a lot of all Southeastern native plants. And it's just a one layer of embodied engagement that we can offer at the Nane, and an educational opportunity to teach about our traditional medicines or our therapeutic medicines from the South.
Yeah.
I can't wait to visit myself.
Me too.
And then, of course, also another part of it is using it as a point of education about the history of all these different mound sites. Like in Louisiana alone, there's over 700 mound sites that archaeologists have actually visited and can be like, that was a mound site. And that's just in Louisiana. You get up into Mississippi and it's probably way, way more than that.
Mhm.
And so just to try to, because Louisiana, Mississippi, they get dogged on as not the best places in the world. And like to be like, no, this is actually one of the cradles of civilization, just like the Nile was. And like to try to just bring some respect to these sites.
Mhm.
It's like Poverty Point is like, dates back 5,000 years before present. And just like, let's let people know about that because so many people have no idea. And so that's, and then also, we have a child that's in the New Orleans school system and they get almost zero history of indigenous peoples in Louisiana. And so we kind of want to push back against that. And hopefully teachers will bring their kids out there to learn a little more and stuff. So
I think it is. I'm like chuckling about you using the term cradle of civilization in the context of this book, but I think it's been a useful thing to throw out into the world, especially for Indigenous people here in Louisiana who may not be aware, or all over the South, like who have been, our own histories have been intentionally distanced from us. And so to talk about a cradle of civilization has really specific meaning in that context. But I'm also noting the irony.
I'm so excited about the gardens. I can't wait to hear and see all the plants y'all are going to bring in. And then I just think about how many animals and pollinators are going to come in there too. And some of the most amazing congregations of birds I've ever seen in my life have been in New Orleans, just like sometimes honestly ditch water, but also definitely at the park. And I'm thinking of the birds that are going to congregate there. I don't know. I love that you guys are weaving this ecology there with intertribal folks, but also with all of that, with the plants and the animals too.
There were a couple of green parrots out there yesterday.
Yes.
Oh, hell yeah.
I love those parrots. Oh my gosh. That's for people who don't know, there's a colony of several colonies probably at this point, of feral monk parakeets that are incredible down there, just big nesting sites of them. And I love tracking those around the town. So cool.
Yeah, I was super excited to see them.
Hell yeah. It's so exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of that cradle of civilization, the book that you mentioned earlier, Jenna May, The Great Power of Small Nations, like that book, I've only read the first couple of chapters, but I'm so enthralled by learning more about just the indigenous history of the lower Mississippi Valley and the Gulf Coast in general, and just how rich with history in so many different nations it has been over the years. And so cool.
It's such an important book and has really changed my thinking, including in how I approach the dawn of everything. This is an Indigenous scholar writing about this area. She is not from this area, but she is Indigenous. And a powerful part of her writing this history is assuming Indigenous presence rather than Indigenous absence, which is unfortunate. Like, it should be standard, and it's actually not how most histories are written, even by people very sympathetic to Indigenous peoples and to Indigenous agency. It's just so ingrained in American historical writing to fragment people, to actually believe the colonial writing that we were disappearing without pushing back and questioning why they were doing that. And so I can't recommend this book enough.
The Bagasse is from Point Capee, which is talked about extensively in that book.
That's cool.
Like one of the centers of where everything was happening at.
Yeah, I'll be reading that next when I get done with The Dawn of Everything, maybe. Which I'm almost done.
So grateful that you guys came in to, I don't know, help us have the whole book in a little bit different perspective in general, not just this chapter, because I think that some of what you're pointing out with the more direct experience and scholarship that you both do also just points to maybe some ways we might want to think about the project of the whole book in general, that there's helpful aspects, and then they're also like falling into some of the same traps of those that came before. I've definitely learned more from talking to y'all about it the whole time, so I'm grateful that the listeners get to do that as well.
Yeah, a book like this is begging for responses, and y'all's have been very necessary.
Cool.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for coming in.
Yeah, thank y'all again
for having us. This is It's really exciting to be on y'all's podcast.
Uh-huh.
The rhymes you are about to hear are true. The rhymes you are about to hear are true.
Get it in, this is about to represent New Orleans style. About to represent all of you know. Local New Orleans. 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 CL, CCCL, CL, CL, CCCL, CL. Tell ya.